passed out folders, tickets,
Yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah.
It's 7 o'clock. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Invite everyone to please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Kathy, would you call the roll, please?
Jim Dombeck,
Here?
Steve Nelson, James Shiloh, Julian Davey,
Here.
Jeff Jacobson,
Here.
Eric Jones,
Present.
Chris Wren, Form's present.
Thank you. Are there any changes to the agenda as proposed? Is there a motion to adopt the agenda as proposed?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Same sign. Motion carries. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented?
So moved. Jones. Second. Jacobson.
Moved and seconded. Roll call?
Davey,
Yes.
Jacobson,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
Dombeck,
Yes.
motion carried.
Next item on the agenda then is public hearing. And this is public hearing for the adoption of a levy in conformance with the requirements of the Truth in Taxation Act. And so I would like to call that hearing to order right now. Invite anyone who would like to speak to the adoption of the levy to come forward. Let the record indicate that no one has come forward to speak. And if there's anyone who wishes to submit written materials, now would be the time to do that. Okay, the record should also reflect that no written materials were submitted. With that being as it is, I will adjourn the hearing, and we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is audience to visitors. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address the board this evening? All right, seeing no one, we'll move on to the next item, communications, correspondence, informational items, letters and newsletters. Several letters in our materials. Thank you. Yeah, most of them, a lot of them came in today. FOIA requests. The material said there were none. Committee reports. I did attend last Friday the Illinois School Board Association virtual, I guess what, conference or I don't know what we would say. It was in lieu of the Triple I conference, but I was able to attend that, and it was very informative. I think it was well done for what they tried to put together. It would be impossible to really put all those sessions from the usual Triple I conference into a virtual format. But they did a good job with selecting presentations. I will say that the majority of presentations we were already in step with. We had already been, I think, following the paths that they were suggesting. And so I think we're on the same course as probably most, if not the real majority of school districts within the state in terms of the way we're handling COVID and the way we're proceeding and just the way we're governing. So really, it was a great experience, And it's always good to check in and make sure that we're kind of in the mainstream with what other districts are doing and what the mainstream of thought is with regard to how to proceed in the times we're in. So it was well done and well worth the time to participate. Any other committee reports? Move on then to the Assistant Superintendent for Business Services report.
Thanks, Jim. I have a couple items on my agenda tonight. The first being a discussion on non-referendum bond issues. At the October 27th board meeting, we had Mr. Ekstrom, our Director of Building and Grounds, and Mr. Wood, who is our architect, talk about the projects in a priority order on what the district needs to get done in the next 10 years, really focusing on the next 3 years. So tonight the discussion is going to be some possible funding of those projects. And so I have Jen Courier here from PMA, and she's going to get up and talk about bonds.
Thank you, Nicole. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. I don't plan to bring up COVID too often tonight, so maybe it'll be a little bit of a breath of fresh air given everything that we've been dealing with as a community, anyway, for much of this year. So tonight I wanted to provide a relatively brief market update on the municipal bond market and also present some possible non-referendum financing options to the district. So beginning on slide 3 of the presentation, we're looking at the existing debt levy details. So these are the total principal and interest payments by bond series listed at the top and by levy year in the leftmost column. So we haven't looked at this in about a year since we last looked at the most recent phase of the restructuring, which was completed in 2019. So as a refresher, the yellow highlighted row is the current tax levy cycle. So we're looking at levy year 2019, which corresponds with tax bills collected this year in 2020. So on the left side of this page, the way this is organized is we show the non-referendum bonds separate from referendum-related debt. And that's because those non-referendum bond payments on the left side of this spreadsheet are subject to an annual limit as far as how much you can levy for non-referendum bonds. And that limit is called the debt service extension base, or you might hear me call it just the DSEB for short. Currently, in the yellow highlighted year, the debt service extension base is about 2.4 million. So you can see the remaining margin for 2019 was about 400,000. Going forward, beginning in 2020, it opens up to about 920,000 and remains that way for the first 9 years or so. And then beyond that, the DSEB opens up more fully. When the district issued its 2019A limited refunding bonds, it structured them intentionally to provide for this level DSEB margin, knowing that there may be a need to accommodate a future borrowing as early as this year. So then when we look at the right-hand side, when we factor in the referendum-related debt service, you can see in the green highlighted column, that's where we're showing annual debt service percentage increase year over year. You can see that going from this current year, highlighted in yellow, to next year, if nothing is done, there would actually be a drop in the overall bond and interest levy. That was also intentional when we structured those bonds last year. We knew that it was possible that the district needed to finance some non-referendum projects, and we intentionally left this drop in there so that if you wanted to proceed with a non-referendum financing, you could do so without breaking the objective of a 6% year-over-year bond levy increase. Okay. So moving on to page 5 for a brief market update. This chart many of you are familiar with. It's the Municipal Market Data, or MMD Index. This is the index off of which tax-exempt municipal bonds price. So in the background, shaded in gray, that's the Fed rate. And then various points along this municipal market data index are represented by those blue and green lines. So the light blue line at the bottom represents the 1-year MMD rate, and you can see how that's very closely tied to the Fed rate. The longer-term municipal bond rates are affected by a whole host of other factors and not as closely tied to what the Fed is doing. This chart takes a look at the MMD index going back to 2003, so you have that historical perspective here. And despite a very volatile period back in spring, which we'll highlight a little bit more on the next page, we're very much back down to historical lows if you look all the way to the right. And the last several months have really settled down in the municipal bond market. So on the next slide, we're just taking a look at this calendar year, so same data, but just highlighting what's happened in recent months. So you can see back in mid-March, which was the beginning of quarantine in the US anyway, many investors simply sold off their municipal bond holdings and sat out of the market entirely for weeks due to the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic and how that was going to affect the financial markets. But by May, you can see in this chart that investors really began to participate again and grew to be more comfortable with what the actual impact and effects of the pandemic were going to be. So for the better half of this year, we've really settled back to historical lows. So it's a very good time to consider a borrowing should you need to proceed with one. On the next page, we're looking at taxable interest rates, and those are tied to treasuries as opposed to the MMD index, which we were just looking at. So this chart is looking at treasury rates going back to 2017. So again, giving a little bit of that historical perspective. And as you can see, for most of this year, we really have been at historical lows, even with taxable rates. Okay, so skipping ahead to borrowing options. Generally, the Illinois School Code prescribes very specific methods for school districts to borrow. So the general obligation bonds, anything you levy for, comes in two categories. The first is general obligation school building bonds, which must be authorized by referendum, and then non-referendum bonds, which there are various types we'll get into on subsequent slides. There are also other borrowings you can do, like alternate revenue bonds, debt or lease certificates, but all of these are ultimately paid for operating dollars and not from a separate tax levy like a general obligation bond. So our focus tonight is really going to be on non-referendum bonds. So because the district is subject to tax caps, that's why your annual debt service payment on any non-referendum debt is limited by this debt service extension base, or DSEB. The original amount of your DSEB was determined back in 1999 and was somewhat arbitrary because it was equal to the amount of non-referendum debt service that you levied for in that year. So luckily for the district, you did have a $2 million levy for non-referendum bonds that year. So your original DSEB started out at $2,026,000. Since 2009, your DSEB has grown annually by CPI. So the DSEB for next year, levy year 2020, is going to be $2,479,000. Okay? So on the next page, we have a visual representation of what your current non-referendum bond payments look like relative to the DSEB. So those blue columns are comprised only of your non-referendum debt, and the solid red line rather, is the current debt service extension base, that $2.4 million annual limit. So you can think of everything under that solid red line as kind of a box that we need to fit any future payments into. So we need to wrap them around what's existing and keep them below that solid red line. The dotted red line represents what that DSEB could grow to, assuming an average CPI of 1.5% per year. So it's hypothetical. We know that the solid red line is where we currently are. The dotted red line is what it could open up to going forward. Okay? So let's talk about the types of non-referendum bonds that are available to the district. The first are working cash bonds. And while those can be done just for operating needs, they can also be done on a tax-exempt basis when you have capital projects to finance. Now, the working cash bond authority is determined by a formula, so we'll take a look at that a little more in depth on the next slide. Life safety bonds are another option, but those have to be issued in evidence of life safety approvals. Funding bonds are another type of non-referendum bond. Those are used to pay off a claim or liability. So when you need to issue for a new money financing, a funding bond would require multiple steps because first you need to establish a claim, then you take it out with a funding bond. So the working cash or life safety bonds, if either one of those can apply, are really more preferable because the timeline is shorter and there are fewer steps to those. Tort bonds are also out there, but those are only for very specific circumstances and wouldn't really apply to the district's situation. So all of these require a Bond Issue Notification Act or BINA hearing. It's much like the Truth in Taxation hearing that you just held. In fact, it's often just as exciting, but it's just a step that we have to go through. And then the working cash and funding bonds both require a 30-day petition process. So what that means is if you were to issue those types of bonds, if more than 10% of the registered voters in the district signed the petition, then in order to proceed with that exact financing, you'd have to take it to referendum. It's very rare that that would happen, especially the larger the community, the larger that target number is, but something we want you to be aware of that we do have to get through in order to issue those types of bonds. Okay. Now, in the district's case, some of the projects may qualify for life safety, but those approvals aren't in place, and the timeline that we have to work with ISB right now is rather lengthy, so most likely that timing really wouldn't work out if we want to hit that 2020 levy. Okay. So looking at the working cash bond authority calculation, what gets factored in is the district's equalized assessed valuation multiplied by what was anyway the maximum ed fund rate. We add in replacement taxes, EBF dollars, and then we have to net off any outstanding working cash bond principal. So once we do all that, the number that's highlighted in green is the total authorized bond issue size given the district's formula right now. And you can see that that amount is $18.2 million. Now, the total projects identified as priorities in the facility assessment were a little bit greater than that. They were about $19.8 million. But factored into this formula is $11.7 million of working cash bond principal. Of that amount, $2.6 million is related to the district's 2013 C bonds, which are actually callable about a year from now. So we discussed with Bond Counsel a potential plan, which we outline on slide 14, that would allow the district to actually issue all $19.8 million as working cash. The way we could do this is issue taxable funding bonds to advance refund those $2.6 million 2013 C working cash bonds. Essentially, those 2013 C bonds, which you already have outstanding, are a claim. That's why you can issue funding bonds in lieu of traditional refunding bonds. So what would happen is it's almost exactly the same as issuing a regular advance refunding bond. And the reason that it would have to be taxable is because it's not currently callable. So it would be another 9 months to a year before a refunding of the 2013 Cs would be tax exempt. But what happens is the refunding bonds would still count toward the working cash formula. So any refunding of working cash still flows in. By calling these funding bonds and identifying the purpose as such in the preliminary official statement, the marketing document for the bonds, that allows us to reclassify those bonds and take them out of the working cash formula. So effectively, at closing, that $2.6 million of working cash bonds related to 2013 C would be cleared out and added back on top of that $18.2 million of authority. So ultimately, what that allows you to do is issue the full 19.8 million as working cash. Now, another benefit, given that taxable rates are as low as they are right now, is that at current market rates, that taxable funding of the 2013 C bonds actually saves, on a present value basis, about $200,000 or 7.8% of the amount that we'd be funding. So at the same time that those funding bonds are issued, you could issue all 19.8 million for projects as one tax-exempt working cash borrowing. And again, this could all be done at the same time and close on the same day. Okay. So we have 3 structures to present to you tonight for your consideration on how this may look as far as the annual debt payments. And with each of these structuring options, we've assumed current market levels plus another 0.5%. Probably more conservative than we need to be, given the timing would be in the next couple of months, but with early January, we have Georgia's runoff elections and the Senate makeup will be known. And depending on how that goes, and of course, knowing the Illinois financial woes that we're in, given the outcome of their latest tax referendum, we really don't know what these rates will look like, so we wanted to be conservative in our assumptions tonight. So looking at page 15, the first option we have is accelerating the repayment of these new bonds. So let me decode the color scheme here a little bit. The blue bars represent the existing debt, including the funding of the 2013 C bonds. So what we're doing is with that taxable funding bond, we're trying to accelerate the repayment of that as quickly as possible, just to not add on to the cost of that part of the financing, since taxable rates are generally higher than tax exempt. On top of that, in the green columns, that's how we're amortizing the tax exempt working cash bonds. So all 19.8 million would be amortized in those green columns. So you can see here, it is filling up to the full current debt service extension based amount, with the exception of the very first year, next year, levy year 2020. You'll notice that we're not quite filling that up to the current DSEB amount because of trying to keep to that overall 6% increase in the bond and interest levy. But beyond that, we are filling up the current DSEB amount, which is cost effective because we are accelerating the repayment as quickly as possible. However, you may be thinking that it is limiting your flexibility to issue future non-referendum bonds should you need to do so. Now again, the DSEB currently is allowed to increase by the rate of CPI. So that dotted line is showing how that margin may increase with CPI. We can't necessarily count on that going on forever. In fact, there has been legislation proposed that hasn't gone through to freeze the DSEBs again and not allow them to increase. So I don't want to say that this is, by any means for certain that you would get that added CPI growth, forever into the future. But regardless, even if it did grow at this rate of about 1.5% per year, you'll notice it would still take several years before that margin is really usable. So this option is the least flexible of the 3 that we're presenting tonight. Okay, and the detail for this is on the next page. So in order to make the numbers a little more legible, I've collapsed all of the referendum debt because we're not really talking about that tonight. So what's happening in all of these structures is the peach highlighted cells represent where the old payments would have been on the 2013 C bonds. So you can see that all of those are going away and are being replaced with the first blue column, which is the taxable funding bond. And again, that's being amortized as short as possible in order to mitigate that additional cost of a taxable bond versus tax exempt. And then the second blue column represents the working cash portion. So you can see how general obligation bonds can be issued up to a term of 20 years. And in this case, we're accelerating the repayment, so it doesn't quite go out 20 years. But what that means is the remaining DSEB margin is virtually zero. So there's not really much capacity to issue any future non-referendum debt without counting on those future CPI increases. And the last thing I wanted to point out on this page is in the green highlighted column, you can see how those annual debt service increases going from 2019 to 2020 are keeping at 6%. Okay. So moving on to scenario 2, what we've done here is we've stretched out the repayment of the working cash bonds so that it goes out the full term of 20 years. And we're filling up to the current DSEB for roughly 5 years. And beginning in levy year 2025, you can see how those columns don't quite reach that current DSEB anymore. They're opening up a little bit more margin. That amount is estimated currently, but it will, of course, depend on market conditions at the time, currently estimated to be between 150 to 160,000 of room, which, for context, would be enough to fit the annual interest payments on a roughly $3, maybe $4 million issue. So this is giving you that flexibility to potentially do an additional borrowing in about 5 years. And again, to the extent that CPI increases are able to be applied to the DSEB, the capacity might be even greater than that amount. Okay. So the detail for this is on the next page. And you can see how the repayment in that second blue column, which represents the working cash issue, the repayment is spread over 20 years, which is how we're able to allow for some remaining margin beginning 5 years from now. Okay. And then we have one more option that we wanted to present to you today, which is very similar to scenario 2, only it opens up the margin 2 years sooner. So if you're feeling like you want that flexibility a couple years sooner than you saw in scenario 2, that's essentially what we're showing here. So if you look at the detail on page 20, the remaining margin in the middle of the page is roughly 150,000 again. It just comes up about 2 years sooner. So 3 years from now, you'd have that DSEB available should there be another non-referendum financing need. Okay. So we do have a brief comparison of these 3 options on page 21. So the estimated net debt service cost of the financings is such that if you go with the accelerated repayment in scenario 1, that is less costly than the other 2 options. However, it is also the least flexible. So based on the current DSEB amount, while the scenario 1 accelerated payback only costs about $28.3 million overall, the first levy year of available DSEB margin is not until 2037. Whereas in scenario 2, for example, which opens up the margin 5 years from now, it is more costly, but it is more flexible than scenario 1. And the same is true moving from scenario 2 to 3. So opening up the DSEB margin a couple years sooner is a little more costly, but it does provide for that flexibility to pop up sooner. Any questions on these? So just so you're aware, the exact structure, should you decide to pursue a non-referendum borrowing, it doesn't have to be selected tonight. In fact, it doesn't really have to be selected for a couple of months. If you think that you'd be interested in pursuing the $19.8 million financing for those facility assessment projects, there are some initial steps that will be required. And at that point in time, you don't need to have determined the exact structure of those bonds. Okay. So if you'd like, we can take a look at the timeline, and I can kind of identify for you those points at which we would really need to know what the structure of the bonds will look like. So I'll skip ahead to page 23. And again, this is a tentative timeline, assuming that we want to hit the 2020 levy. So in order to do so, we would need to be sure that levies are filed with the county clerk by March 1st. So if this is something the board would like to move forward with, we could do so beginning with the next meeting on December 8th. It would require the board to adopt a notice of intent for both the taxable funding bonds and the tax-exempt working cash bonds, as well as have an order signed which calls for that BINA hearing. Shortly thereafter, we would publish the notice of intent in the local paper, which is what kicks off that 30-day petition period that I mentioned before. January 12th could be the date of the BINA hearing. And then sometime in mid-January, depending on the exact publication date, is when that 30-day petition period would end, which would allow by as early as January 26th for the board to approve a parameters resolution, which would actually authorize the sale of the bonds. So it's really at that January 26th meeting where we would need to have that direction as far as the structure of the bonds. Okay, and then ultimately, if this is something the board would like to pursue, this timeline would allow us to have a little bit of flexibility with the sale date because we could target, right after that January 26th meeting or wait until early to mid-February should the market not be, for whatever reason, in our favor late January. Okay. Any questions?
Tons of questions for Jen, so.
Thanks, Jen. This is more of a question for Nicole, maybe. So what might pop up that we may need an additional $4 million to issue non-referendum bonds?
Yeah, so Jen and I talked about that when we were putting these scenarios together, and because we just went through the facility assessment, we feel fairly confident that we've gotten everything that we need to do on that list.
Exactly. I mean, it was quite the extensive list. So
It's very excessive, yeah. But of course, I guess something could pop up that we don't have on there as far as a roof needing to be repaired that maybe we don't feel is something that is at the point that needs to be replaced in the next 10 years. Just thinking about your own house, there's always things that kind of pop up that you would need to do. But you could also use that money if we needed to put an addition on a school. But we don't anticipate anything like that in the near future. So really it's the board's level of comfortableness of where you want this first year of available DSEB out there. So that's kind of why we have a large range of years on here, going from 2037 all the way to 2023, and having that DSEB available a little bit earlier.
And my other question is, as we issue these bonds, last time we had FGM, they said they were going to sharpen their pencils and that the cost could be a lot lower, and we're in a very competitive bid environment. So if we have $19 million worth of bonds that we issue, let's suppose those projects come in much lower. What happens to that funding overall that we don't use? Do we pay that back or?
No, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, but the bonds don't have to be for specific projects laid out. We know it has to be working cash, which would be transferred to our O&M fund. But we wouldn't necessarily have to lay out specific projects when we go through this process. So if for the first 3 years that money comes in lower than what we anticipate, then we would able to use that money for other projects that we have next on our priority list. So we could potentially start doing projects that we have listed in years 4, 5, and 6, let's say, so we can start hitting some of those.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess, because I'm conservative by nature,
Yeah,
as a property owner and businessman,
yeah.
it's always like, this is what we need, this is our want, this is what we need, this is what we need to get, that's it, so.
Well, and that's our,
Seems like it's a little bit a horse before the buggy.
well, and that's our hope, is that we would be able to do more of those projects that we have laid out as we go down our priority list with that $19.8 million.
Nicole, is there anything about the issuance of these bonds in coordination with the timing of the projects as they've been laid out that would help us with our tax anticipation warrant situation? As far as, does the extra cash generated from this bond issuance in our working cash fund alleviate the need maybe to issue tax anticipation warrants for the next couple of years as those projects are performed?
No, because this money would be specifically in the debt service fund, so that wouldn't be money that we would be able to use for operating funds. Correct, yeah.
Right. So the only thing we'd need to watch for really, because you were absolutely right earlier, Nicole, about working cash bonds for capital projects, the benefit there is you're not tied to the specific projects. Because they would be tax exempt, we would want to make sure that we have a reasonable expectation to spend the proceeds within about 3 years from the date of issuance. But other than that, it's definitely, fungible. It can go to different projects that would qualify as tax exempt capital projects. With life safety bonds, for example, that's where you're a little more tied. You have to match project to approval. But with working cash, that wouldn't be the issue.
I would assume that eventually our choices, if we decide to go down this road, are going to be between scenario 2 and 3. And there's such a small difference between the two. I'm not sure why we wouldn't go with scenario 3. Is there any, am I reading that correctly?
I would agree with you. That was my reaction as well. The only thing is there could be a longer horizon that you'd like to see that DSEB filled up for. For example, maybe you feel confident that it's going to be at least 7, 8, maybe 10 years before you need that flexibility. That would be another option we could take a look at, and that might have a bigger impact on that bottom line number. But you're correct. The cost between scenarios 2 and 3 is really not as great. So to have that additional flexibility, might be worth it, even if you don't anticipate needing it.
Are these bonds, we can't pay them off early. We have to go the entire length of the bond offering, correct?
So they would be callable, like many of your other bonds are. So there would be an opportunity, for example, to refinance for savings down the road. Typically, the calls are about 9 or so years away, 9 to 10 years.
So if on what I would assume is an unlikely possibility, but with the unlikely possibility that we didn't need to use all this money to do our projects, we could use some of it to pay off the outstanding bonds early.
Potentially, yes. That is, one option if you had those excess proceeds, and particularly if you weren't able to spend them within that 3-year horizon, as you initially thought you would, then that would be one way to use those funds. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, I guess I'd defer to your experience from a historical standpoint, but I guess I was leaning more towards scenario 1, thinking that if we have identified sufficiently what we think are going to be the projects for the next 5 to 10 years, and that hopefully the DSEB ceiling based on CPI is giving us some breathing room there 5 to 10 years out, that we might save $2 million by just going with the accelerated debt repayment. But is there something from your experience that would point you to wanting to have that sort of flexibility in there 5 years from now?
Yeah, because as much as we want to think that we can see down the road, even 3, 5 years, whatever, there's always that potential that we miss something or something comes up that we didn't anticipate, and we need that additional flexibility. So I think from a planning standpoint, it's always a good idea to preserve as much of that as you can, just for that kind of a scenario. Especially when we have the opportunity to pay back on a callable basis if we need to. If we have the money available, we can do that. But in the meantime, I think we're so tight, and we really don't know what the economy holds in store for us. We don't know what the state budget holds in store for us. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty going forward. And I hate to go into the future where there is so much uncertainty, maybe not from our perspective in terms of what we think projects are going to cost, but we could be off on those. We don't know. I mean, there could be such a demand for projects elsewhere, or there could be, a number of companies that go out of business. We just don't know what the future might hold. So it's always good, I think, to preserve if we can. As long as it's a reasonable basis, to preserve that flexibility. You never look back and regret having preserved flexibility if you need it, but I'll tell you from bitter experience that if you don't preserve that flexibility and you do need it going forward, it's a big problem. It's a big problem. And the example I would give to you, and it's really unrelated to bond financing, but yet it still is important, and that is that we many years ago made a decision not to levy in the tort fund, and because we made that decision, now we can't levy in the tort fund, and so in many ways our hands are tied as to what we can do there. And looking back, had we really thought about it a little bit more clearly, we would have probably preserved a little bit of flexibility at least so that we could deal with future issues. But, that's just an example of why I think it's always a good idea to have some flexibility built in.
Is there direction that you guys would like to provide so we can look at a timeline, or are there other scenarios that you would like to see? I did talk with Steve Nelson about this on the phone since he wasn't able to be here. He said he too was also leaning towards scenario 3. He felt comfortable with that. So I just wanted to share that with you guys. He said I could share that tonight also. So,
Is that your recommendation, Nicole?
My recommendation would, yes, be scenario 3.
Then I'm comfortable with that.
And I certainly, that would be my pick as well.
So as far as the timeline that Jen has laid out here, are you comfortable with moving forward then on the December 8th board meeting? Or like Jen said, we could push it back if we need to?
Well, I think we can at least try to follow this schedule, and if at any point in time we come to a standstill, then we can abandon it, but at least we can embark on a process now and have a process in place and start to go down the road so that we don't get left behind later on if we do decide to go this way.
Okay. All right, so
I think that would make sense.
I'll work with Jen and we'll move forward then for the December 8th meeting.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone.
You too.
You too.
The second item that I have tonight is the approval of the 2020 tax levy resolution. Go to that first slide here. I just have a couple of refresher slides from what was presented with the tentative levy. Nothing has changed. Just a refresher on what the extension is that we are asking for 2020. We're looking at a 3.24% increase. This will change with the restructuring of the 2013 C bonds that Jen just brought up, because we currently do have a 5.53% decrease projected for the debt service fund, and so that amount will change. So the increase will be a little bit higher there. And then as far as the total tax rate, if you go to the next slide there, we are looking at about a 6-cent decrease in the total tax rate. Again, these are just tentative numbers. We'll know for sure once our final EAV comes in and our total new construction. So I'll ask for.
One thing I just wanted, I know that from some of the letters and comments that we've received, that there is a feeling that we're actually raising taxes when indeed we're actually lowering the rate.
Correct.
Which doesn't mean that people will actually see a reduction in their tax bill. And if they don't, it's because the assessed valuation on their house has gone up.
Right.
So their house is worth more.
Right.
And even though we've reduced the rate, they still might pay the same or a little bit more because the value of their house has increased. Correct. And I know that's somehow doesn't always translate properly, but we are indeed reducing our rate, albeit not by a huge amount, but I think we're trying to go in the right direction.
Correct. This is the third year we've actually lowered our rate.
Yes.
So we're moving in the right direction.
Right. Is there a motion to adopt the 2020 tax levy resolution as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion, further discussion? I guess we've already talked about this.
No, I just think I'd add on to what you said, that we also went through a recent $6 million budget reduction process over 3 years that I think was really prudent for our taxpayers, and I think showed our resolve to trying to keep ourselves disciplined. And I think the school report card also is very illustrative in showing that we, on average, compared to the state, spend less per pupil to educate our students than other districts in the state. So I think that we're by and large doing everything that we should be responsibly with the budget.
Any other discussion? Roll call?
Jacobson?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Davy?
Yes.
Dombeck?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Superintendent's report.
Well, good evening, everybody. I do have a couple of items to report on, the first of which is the return to learning plan, really just kind of an update. Given the circumstances and the move to an adaptive pause, there's not a whole lot of information there, but I do have some information to share. So we'll start with some of the slides that we see every meeting. First of all, our mission, empowering all learners to succeed in their world. Our vision, which is to provide an ideal learning experience where students and staff are engaged and want to come back the next day. Our core values, which are honesty, trustworthiness, integrity, equality, empathy, respect, citizenship, digital citizenship, responsibility, and collaboration. And the 5 questions that our professional learning communities ask: what do we want students to know and learn? What do students want to know and learn? How will we know if they have learned it? What will we do if they don't learn it? And what do we do if they already know it? And with that takes me to the return to learning update. So really just kind of a couple of reminders. The adaptive pause that was implemented will start actually Monday, November 30th. That's next Monday. It'll end January 18th, 2021, after the first of the year. It ends on that date, the first day back would technically be Tuesday, January 19th. That would, the 18th is Martin Luther King Day. That's based on the recommendation from the Health Department. A couple bullets down, all schools in DeKalb County implemented that recommended adaptive pause, so everybody in the county is on pause until January 18th. One clarification, I've had several emails about this issue. The pause is a transition to remote learning. The Health Department did not recommend closing schools. That's why staff are able to still be in schools. We will have some special education students, very few at first, but it does allow us to consider bringing additional special education students back because the schools aren't closed. The Health Department has recommended that we transition back to remote learning. I mentioned the fourth bullet down, I did mention that some students will attend in small groups during the pause. Primarily those are special education students, but it does open the door for small groups of general education students to be able to come into the buildings and work with staff. We aren't quite halfway through the school year, but we're getting close to halfway through the school year. So we've identified students who are struggling academically, and again, the Health Department didn't recommend closing schools. It does leave the opportunity for small groups of students to come in. We really want to be cautious here at first, especially after Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, the trend in data is that after holidays, we see a spike in COVID cases. So we want to be cautious after Thanksgiving, but we'll watch those numbers and then work with our staff. Again, based on staff availability, we may start to bring students back in very small groups. I do also want to highlight that while the implementation of the hybrid model in grades K through 5 was very short, I think it was very important that we had the opportunity to do that, both in terms of connecting students and staff and students being able to get into the buildings and connect with each other and the teachers. But I think one of the other critical parts was to be able to implement that hybrid model. There was a lot of questions about how that was going to work, how the teachers were going to be able to use the technology. I know that there were a lot of challenges, and it was brand new, so there were some struggles that came with that. But we did have the opportunity to test that model a little bit. So as we look to January 19th and the opportunity to come back, again, hoping that numbers go in the right direction, we've got some experience. So we wouldn't be starting fresh with that, at least in K through 5. In the middle school and the high school staff that would be implementing that model can rely on the K-5 teachers to get a little bit of an experience of what that was like, what were the challenges, and be prepared to implement that on January 19th. Again, our plan is to resume hybrid learning on January 19th. One of the challenges we still have is that we don't have a ship date for the new Chromebook, so we continue to stay in touch with our vendor, and as soon as we get a ship date, we'll certainly let the board know about that. We'll continue to monitor the health data and other circumstances in the community, as well as as well as coordinating with the health department on any future decisions. So as we approach the November 4th date, I started to get questions about, well, are we really going to go back? Are we really going to go back? And one of the things that I told our staff, and I think is important for our community to know also, is that date needs to be a target. We need to plan to return on that date, and I think January 19th is the exact same. We will always continue to monitor information, monitor data, work with our staff and our administrative team, but we have to identify that date so we're moving in the right direction. If the numbers don't look good or the information doesn't look good after the first of the year, then of course we're going to take that into consideration. But I think that everybody needs to know that the plan is to return on Tuesday, January 19th. We are hoping for and we'll be looking for a downward trend in the number of cases and test positivity in DeKalb County and in our local community, and I'll talk about zip code data here in just a second. That question rather was asked of the health department kind of point blank. At what point would you recommend that schools be able to open up? Is there a certain number? Do we have to get down to that 8% for the health department to support schools opening? And the answer was no. First of all, the 8% isn't the number. Second of all, there isn't a number. The situation has been so fluid that one of the things that the health department staff will look for is a trend coming down, that the number of cases are going down, that the test and case positivity are going down. So if we were to see that, especially over the next 6 weeks, but especially after the first of the year, if we start to see those trends going down, of course, we would keep in touch with the health department. But that's one of the things, in fact, probably the major thing that they're going to be looking for is a downward trend in the number of cases and the test positivity. So along those lines, there is some good news that I want to share. And you won't see it right away, but you'll see it here in a couple of slides. So this is information that I've been tracking for the last couple of months. This is the number of new cases per 100,000 residents in DeKalb County. It's as of November 15th. So we're talking about a week ago. And the blue line represents the number of new cases about every week. And you can see how that number has gone up. And based on the last number that was reported, we're still going up. The next slide is test positivity in DeKalb County. And much like the last slide, the numbers most recently reported were as of 11/15, November 15th. And again, you can see the trend is still going up for test positivity. This, however, is Region 1 rolling test positivity rates as of yesterday, November 21st. And if you go back to 11/15 on this chart, you can see that we didn't quite hit the peak on the 15th, that we were about 19.9%. This is all of Region 1. This is Ogle County, Lee County, Winnebago, every county in Region 1. You can see we actually hit the peak on November 12th, but you can see that those numbers are starting to gradually come down throughout the entirety of Region 1. And the last reported number on yesterday was 16.3% test positivity. The next slide is actually DeKalb County test positivity. And if you look back to November 15th, you can see that number was 15.1%. We actually hit our peak on 11/13, but since 11/13, we've gradually started to come down, and from a peak of 16.8%, as of yesterday, that number was 12.1% in DeKalb County. So we're moving in the right direction. That's a great thing. The next slide shows that in kind of a graphical form. So the first two graphs we saw were still going up, which is what we don't want to see. This graph starts to show those test positivity rates coming down, and that is exactly what we want to see. We're still a ways off from that 12% threshold, still a ways off from the 8%. However, we're moving in the right direction, and that's a good thing. I think the next two slides are the Sycamore and Cortland zip code. These are case positivity rates. In it, excuse me, as of today, in the 60178 zip code, the case positivity was 14.84%. That's down from 21% about a week ago. So also moving in the right direction. The next slide is Cortland and shows a very similar trend. Cortland hit its peak on the 17th at 22.02%, and now, as of this afternoon, was down to 14.65%. So again, moving in the right direction. I think that's what the health department is going to want to see. We hope those numbers continue to get better. I'm glad to see those numbers getting better. However, I do want to really ask our community, our county, we're moving in the right direction. Let's keep that moving in the right direction. We have 3 holidays coming up that are really important, and really, I think the main concern from the health department in terms of numbers of COVID cases, Thanksgiving gatherings, Christmas gatherings, and then New Year's gatherings. And unfortunately, the history is that we see these dips, and then a holiday happens, and for about 2 weeks after that, we see the numbers climb again. Because it takes about 2 weeks for the number of cases to really escalate. The incubation period for COVID is anywhere from 2 to 14 days. So we really don't know what the data is going to look like after Thanksgiving until about 2 weeks into December. And right about the time we know what that data is, Christmas is right around the corner, and then we're kind of back to square one. So these are great numbers. I want to commend our community, both here in Sycamore and in Cortland, as well as DeKalb County and really in the entire region for moving in the right direction. However, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So it's important that we kind of hold the line. We're starting to hear more and more about vaccines. Great effective rates, for vaccines in the 90%. Starting to hear about some vaccines maybe being available and ready to distribute by the end of the calendar year for the first round of essential workers, healthcare workers. And that's great news. Hopefully there are vaccines that are going to be available and safe and for staff, parents being willing to give those vaccines or allow those vaccines to be administered to their children. And we can start to put this behind us. I heard a health official on the news the other night say there's finally some light at the end of the tunnel. That's great to hear, but it's still a ways off. So I would implore our community, enjoy the holidays as best you can, but continue to be safe. Let's keep these numbers moving in the right direction so that we can get students back in school. I think that's the last slide on health data. And really, the last comments I had for the return to learning plan now that we've moved to an adaptive pause. But I will stop here for a second and answer any questions the board may have.
Steve, you had mentioned that there are small groups of students who come to back to the school in the actual facility. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little more upon those? I know that there are some other circumstances, but in general, kind of.
Sure. One of the things that the state board has asked us from the very beginning was to identify those most vulnerable populations or the students that need the most support. So when we transitioned, prepared to transition to this adaptive pause and back to remote learning, one of the things I told the staff and the administrative team was, we're not closing schools. Think of this as the day before November 4th, or rather that Thursday. That was the last day kind of remote learning prior to the hybrid model. We had special education students in our ABLE program, in our LEAF program, and we had some other students coming in just on a kind of case-by-case basis that were really struggling with academics. That number of students was very low because we were just starting to do that, especially at the high school and the middle school. So it's a very small number of students. As we start this adaptive pause, the students in our ABLE programs and our life school are the students that are probably going to be coming back first. There were some staffing availability issues there with some of the other programs. So we're going to target the ABLE and the life school programs first, and that's probably a total of 30 students throughout the district. So really looking at a very small number. But if that goes well and the staffing availability improves, then we would again look at our LEAF programs and some of our instructional special education student programs to start bringing those students back. Again, it would, depends on staffing availability and some of the other issues that are out there, but that's the intent. And once November 30th hits, we'll start to move in that direction and see how things go.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Steve, is there any hope either at the local level or at the county health department level that if we see cases continue this downward trend through December, that January 19th date might get moved up a week or two? I mean, I know that we're expecting perhaps to see a jump after the holidays, but just supposing that we don't see one after 2 weeks after Thanksgiving and we don't see one start of January, which would be a week after Christmas. I mean, is there any hope that date might get moved up, or is it pretty hard right now?
So we asked that question point blank of the health department officials because we were kind of hopeful that could happen. And I think that there was an acknowledgement that that's always a possibility. But the fear is that the trend was so clear at the time. If you go back to those first couple of graphs and see that positive increase, the threshold for the number of cases was somewhere between 50 and 100 cases, in a week. And I think last week the number was 628. So I'm going to speculate here a little bit. And if the numbers continue to go down, especially through, the Thanksgiving holiday, I think that there would be some conversation about that January 19th date, potentially moving up. If as a community we can, kind of demonstrate that we can hold the line and keep those numbers down and the health department felt it was safer, I'm sure that they would be open to that conversation. But when we asked that question point blank, there was such real fear is really not probably the right word, but concern about the increase over the previous couple of weeks, that they didn't want to be tied down to an answer. But I think if the community demonstrates that we can move things in the right direction, I think that's absolutely something that we'll need to consider, for sure.
And as we get closer to January, where it's going to, I think, be even more crucial from a technology standpoint that we have these Chromebooks, do we have a drop-dead date where we say we have to find another option? I mean, it seems like every month we get together and there's still no ship date, and I know you've told me there's no way we can get out of this contract, but it seems to me there's got to be some alternative. I mean, what if they never deliver? What if it's May and we're a year in now and they're saying, well, we still don't know?
Well, and we've had those exact conversations
I know
in
you
the tech
have.
department, what happens if? And part of the problem is the contract. Part of the problem also is just the availability from other vendors. Because our tech staff has contacted other vendors, if we were to get out of our contract, do you have Chromebooks available? And most of them tell us right off the bat they're in the same boat. They can put the orders in just like everybody else, but now your orders are going to the bottom of the list as opposed to where we're at currently. There have been a couple of cases that initially seemed promising. Yeah, I can get my hands on 1,500 Chromebooks for you, and when we start to do a little digging, it's, well, we can get those for you, but we have to put an order in for them, and we think we can get them sooner, but we can't make a promise, and it's kind of the same situation. So because of that, we have not identified a drop-dead date. We continue to work with our vendor. We are at the top. I think we're the number 2 order that they have. Not really sure where that stands with Lenovo. These devices are Lenovo devices. But they feel pretty confident that we're towards the top of their list. So as those orders start to get filled, we should be one of the first ones that receive the shipment. They're really not seeing a whole lot of shipments being received quite yet, either for other devices or from other vendors. The hope is that once we get into December and January that things start to move a little bit. There seem to be some signs pointing to that possibility, but there's still kind of been a holding pattern too until Lenovo starts to release those devices. Good question. It's frustrating. Every month we talk about the same thing, and our vendor's been great. He answers emails and all sorts of things, and his hands are tied. Other questions?
I have a couple. I don't know if these are fair to ask you or not, but when you're dealing with the county health department, are they more driven by our local numbers, or are they kind of married to the district numbers, which take in much bigger population, especially some of those northern counties that are their rates are so much higher than ours?
If you go back to that COVID page from IDPH and look at the Region 1, you can see the variance from county to county. Our county health department's really focused on our county. So when we talked about Sycamore or DeKalb or Genoa, they recognize that there are smaller populations within the county, but they were very clear in that our goal is to bring the number of cases down in the county. And the schools have a big part in that, but so do each of the communities within the county and so on and so forth. So they monitor everything, but, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they were very clear. Our focus is DeKalb County.
Another question that I have for you is, and I know this is somewhat premature, but yet we want to be future focused, and the question is, has there been any discussion surrounding how vaccine will be made available when it does come to us?
Another great question, and one that we asked the health department also, because they would be certainly involved in the distribution of a vaccine. Right. So along those lines, they're really kind of relying on IDPH to give them some information, because that will be a statewide distribution. So they're starting to have those conversations, but they don't have firm plans in place quite yet, just because it's still a little bit farther out. And everybody, I think, had been kind of waiting until a point where it seemed like it was necessary to start having those conversations, as opposed to not having those conversations too early and then vaccines, taking longer than expected. So that will be coordinated by the health department. They'll do that in conjunction with IDPH and other health departments around the state, but there's no firm plan quite yet. The conversations have started, but no firm plan yet.
Well, the sooner the better, I think, because, as soon as we have access to the vaccine, it would be nice to get it out in a orderly and really a quick manner.
I agree.
And so it would be interesting to see where they're going to put our students in the hierarchy, just at least to have some kind of ranking in terms of who would be most likely to get it first. I mean, they have to start thinking in terms of that. Otherwise, we're going to be behind the 8 ball.
I would assume that schools, students and staff are not in the first round. I think they'll focus on healthcare and first responders, but I would hope that the, school staff and students might be in that second round. Then one of the questions is the vaccine required for students to return to school?
Right.
I would personally speculate that ISB is likely to issue some sort of requirement with the same kind of exemptions that parents have at their disposal now, medical, religious exemptions. But I think it's very likely that State Board of Education will require students to have that vaccine before they can return. Then the question is staff, and I've had many conversations with folks about the vaccine and the safety of the vaccine, and some people are willing to get it and some people aren't. So that'll be another bridge that we have to cross, is that it might be available and ready to distribute. But if people have legitimate concerns about the vaccine, how do we handle that and those sorts of things?
Yes, but I mean, I'd like to see our teaching staff be considered somewhere in the neighborhood of first responders or immediately after first responders, because that's where they are.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we can lobby to kind of get that kind of ranking in there so that they have some of the first availability to the vaccine, should they choose to go in that direction. So.
And I agree, and I think the health department knows that that's the stance of schools throughout the county. I think because there's uncertainty about what that plan is going to look like, I'm not sure how much flexibility they'll have, but absolutely, we will make sure that they know that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's too early to start those discussions. I think, I think if anything, we may wait too long and then have a situation where we're, like I say, behind the 8 ball and not quite up to par. So it would be nice to be ahead of this one. I attended a virtual conference and the speaker was General Petraeus, retired General Petraeus, and he said his famous line was when he was over in the Middle East was, how is this going to end? Tell me, in this scenario that you're planning out, how this is going to end and how we're going to get there to the end. And so I think we have to start making some of those plans, and maybe we have to change as we go along, but at least we have a plan that's calculated to lead to a successful end. So
that's a good one. I'm going to share the quote from General Petraeus, but also keep in touch with the health department.
Yeah.
As that plan gets
I think, that's the part of the frustration, is that the health department really, controls the ball.
Yeah.
And so we need to work with them, and we need to get information from them. But I think by the same token, we should be prodding them a little bit, saying, how's this going to end?
Yeah, I think that's a good question to ask. They've been great to work with, and I know that they want to work with us as the vaccine becomes available, but we'll just keep that conversation going.
Yeah.
Prodding's a good word for it. Any other questions about the Return to Learn plan or update? Okay.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the next item under the superintendent's report, which is the 21-22 district calendar. This is the second reading, and tonight you should all have a copy of the calendar. at your place so you have a better idea of what it looks like. We did get a user-friendly version of the calendar. It's out to the staff this afternoon, so they've had a chance to get it out. Again, we worked with the SCA to create the calendar. It mirrors the current calendar. We are assuming that there's no COVID impact on next year's calendar. And as a result, I'm recommending this calendar for the board approval tonight. There have been some questions about modifying the calendar for a variety of reasons, and I will tell you that there's talk in Springfield, rumblings in Springfield rather, about the possibility of extending the school year because of the learning loss and dealing with the pandemic. Those are rumblings right now. So we'll see what happens, especially in January, in the legislative session in the spring. I think that there will be a lot of voices for and against that sort of thing in the spring. So I think we let that kind of happen. If for any reason we wanted to do something locally to the current school year calendar or next year's calendar, it can always be amended. Of course, we would want to provide as much early notice as we can. But it could always be amended if we felt like that was the right thing to do. So I think at this point, I would recommend that the board approve this calendar that you have in front of you tonight. And just know that as we continue to progress through this school year, if there's a reason that we need to consider amending the calendar, we can still do that for the current school year or for next year.
Is there a motion to approve the 2021-2022 calendar as presented?
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? We just do a voice vote on this one, or do we need a roll call? Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you.
So the last item under the superintendent's report is called Future Focused. So this is something new that I'll talk a little bit about tonight. I grabbed some low-hanging fruit to have this conversation tonight. Yeah, I think you'll understand that here in just a second. But that really comes as a result of some conversation that I had with a couple of board members after the board admin retreat. There was great conversation during that retreat about a variety of topics. A lot of it was focused on COVID and where we were at the time. But one of the last conversations I had with a couple of board members that night had to do with what can we do to make sure that we're always thinking ahead? So we're not kind of caught in the present. We're not caught behind the 8 ball because we haven't thought into the future. So the idea was to regularly put a future-focused agenda item on the board agenda. So what I would recommend is that we do this once a month, not necessarily every board meeting, but once a month, and that the topic really kind of varies. And this month, the topic is technology. Again, I think that's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's a topic we've talked about a little bit before and how we're using technology. But it could be anything. It could be budget. It could be curriculum. It could be facilities. It could be a variety of things. So I've picked this topic, and I'll continue to select those as needed. But I would invite the board, if there are certain topics that the board would like to talk about, please let me know, and we'll work that into the agenda. So tonight the topic is future focused, or technology for future focused. Talked a little bit about where this came from. So my goal behind this would be to share information about how we're planning for the future, to hold ourselves accountable for planning for our future. It's really easy to talk about these things once and then forget about them, and they kind of fall through the cracks. So having regular conversations about them helps us to hold ourselves accountable. And then to have some opportunity for discussion. So I may bring information to the board. I may have one of the directors or Nicole or Nick bring information to the board, but then have a little bit of opportunity for discussion about it. So it gives us some insight from the board, maybe a little bit of direction, but also just kind of some open discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, tonight's topic is increased integration of technology. So what I did first of all was kind of go through the district's strategic plan and pick out some things that really related to technology. And some of these we've talked about, some on kind of a regular basis. So from the portion of the strategic plan where we talk about beliefs, learners progress at different rates in different ways for different futures. Learning facilitators, most often teachers, but it could be anybody within the school district, are innovative, enthusiastic, lifelong learners. And learning facilitators empower all learners to reach their individual potential. So these are just some of the beliefs that I think really kind of apply to the use of instructional technology in schools. The next slide talks about parts of the district's vision that comes from the strategic plan. So some of those visions are that learning opportunities are not limited by the constraints of time or structure. I think we're really starting to see that now. We're experiencing that in both our remote and our hybrid plans. Learning opportunities are differentiated to maximize learners' experience, progress at different rates in different ways for different futures. I'll talk about this in a little bit more here in just a second, but both differentiation and individualizing opportunities for learners I think is important. I think that's one thing that the technology can help us do. Learning opportunities motivate learners to learn at their individual maximum pace. The learning community makes maximum use of technology to access challenging and exciting online learning. One of the things that I had the opportunity to do over the years as an educator was really to spend some time researching technology and how it's used in schools. And one of the things that I think has been really dramatic over the last several years is that there's just opportunities for students that weren't available before because we didn't have technology. Whether it's a simulation, you get to see pictures of things, or videos of certain experiences. Technology just opens doors that we didn't have available to us before. The limited, maybe by textbooks. Anyone can learn anything from anywhere at any time. And the last vision I put in here was that learners use technology to improve competitiveness in the global market. So we know that our students don't just compete here in Sycamore or in DeKalb County or in Illinois. They really are competing at a global level. So helps them to do that a little bit better. So what can technology do? And I just listed a couple of things here, things that I wanted to throw out, but certainly open for discussion and questions. Increased access to instructional technology can increase student engagement. One of the things that I think is really important, one of the things I've learned over the years, is that just because you give a student a computer doesn't mean that they gain 10 points on the SAT or on the MAP test. Most of the time, though, what it does is engages students in ways that they weren't engaged before. Again, if you compare a laptop or an iPad and a textbook, if you give most students those three choices, they're going to go for one of the two pieces of technology. So what it does is really engage students more, which gives those learning facilitators, those teachers, the opportunities to engage students in a variety of curricula. Technology facilitates opportunities beyond the classroom, facilitates for individualized learning, for differentiated learning, and facilitates flexibility in scheduling. So this one, probably the easiest example is at the high school level, maybe at the middle school level. When students have technology, especially now in this remote learning environment, we know that they can learn at their own pace. And it's a lot easier for teachers or learning facilitators to encourage students to kind of move off in different directions. Gifted education has really kind of fallen through the cracks over the years because we've paid more attention to students who are struggling, and I think rightfully so. Those should be the priorities. But we're seeing a renewed emphasis on gifted education in the state of Illinois. Dr. Webster has talked with me a little bit about that. We've talked about that a little bit at the admin team level. So these are students who are eager to learn. They have, in many cases, they are intrinsically motivated to learn on their own, and technology can give them the opportunity to do that. With that kind of independence and with that kind of motivation, teachers can work with those students to let them kind of run at their own pace. So in order to allow students to do that, sometimes we have to have some flexibility in scheduling and what we're allowing them to do. And I think in the easiest way to describe that is at the high school level, where we have older students who are a little bit more mature and probably a little bit better able to handle that. But I bet if we walked the halls at the middle school under normal circumstances, we could probably pick out more than a handful of students that were probably ready for that too, and maybe even at the elementary level also. So while flexibility in scheduling is easiest to visualize at the high school level, I think that's something that we could see at both the middle school and the elementary level. Is that the last slide on that, David? No. So what would be some of my goals? First and foremost, I think one of the things that's really important is maintaining the appropriate infrastructure to support the current short and long-term implementation of technology throughout the district. One of the things I've read and learned and talked to other administrators about is that you can have all the iPads and all the Chromebooks that you want, but if you don't have the infrastructure in place to support them, the wireless networks and the broadband, the bandwidth, they're useless. So one of the things that's really important is that we have to, at that level, kind of make sure that we have the appropriate infrastructure in place. And that happens really behind the scenes, but if you don't have that in place, you're really in trouble. Obviously, we want to receive and then distribute the new Chromebooks that we've ordered for students in grades K through 8. We want to continue to review and consider software for use within the district. So one really good example that the board has heard about is Canvas at the high school. I think there is a desire to at least look at that at the middle school level and see how that could be implemented at the middle school. But that's just one, Canvas is just one example. There are all sorts of software programs out there, many of which are free, but some of which are available at a cost. And considering how those programs would work for our students, for our staff, how it would facilitate learning and take us from where we are to kind of the next level. We want to make sure that, I would like to make sure that we involve staff in the planning process. So that's not just decisions we make at the district level or even at the building level. We want to make sure that staff are involved in that and have an opportunity to review and pilot hardware and software. When we started to put the configurations together for teachers in their classrooms at the elementary and really all 3 levels, we purchased some of those devices first for the hybrid model and then gave teachers a chance to work with them and try them out. And I think that's the way that we learn the best. And the last goal I put on there is that we really want to emphasize professional development to facilitate successful implementation. And there's kind of a balance here. I had a great conversation just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, about professional development and how critical it is. And with technology, I think that's a really good example. Teachers have to be able to use the software in order to take advantage of the software. But there's kind of this balance where you have to give them enough information to work the software, help them learn how to apply it a little bit. But for all of us who've used a computer before, at some point, you just have to start using it, right? You just have to jump in the water. So there's this balance between providing professional development, making sure that staff has all the tools to use it effectively, and then let them run with it. And then provide ongoing professional development so that as they advance, we bring in trainers or our own staff who are advanced and can help staff continue to grow and use it effectively. Do I have one more slide, David? All right, other possible goals. Some things to consider are site visits where technology is being used effectively. So what does a schedule at a high school look like that looks different from ours? And I know that we've talked about some flex mod scheduling here in the past. Is that something to revisit? Are there different schedules that would help us implement that sort of thing at the high school level? And really take, a kind of a traditional high school and make it almost look like a community college, or at least some sort of blend between the two where students have more freedom and flexibility, although we still have to live within some of the constraints and the requirements from the state. More brainstorming and planning to continue thinking outside of the box. For many years, I was part of conversations where we thought about, gosh, what would it look like if we use technology, if we let students learn on their own, what would that look like? And now we're doing it. Schools have kind of been forced to do that and figure out how to do it. And it's, in my opinion, it's worked really well. It's not without its challenges. But those kind of conversations and brainstorming sessions need to continue. We talked about these things for many years, and then we finally were forced to do it, and we did it. How were we successful, and what did we learn? What did we learn? The last bullet point there was reviewing the practices of both remote and hybrid learning for successes and areas of improvement. I think it went really well, but there are ways that we can make it better. And as time goes on and and the pressure of COVID is relieved and we're kind of back to normal, one of the things I've talked to our team about is, what are we doing now? What are we doing now that's different, that's better? And how do we make sure that we don't lose that? And at the same time, how do we make sure that we don't slide back into practices that are just comfortable, that may not necessarily be as effective as we want them to be? So, those are conversations I'll have with our team here, and they'll have with their staff. We'll have those for a long time here. But those are important things to do so that we are thinking for the future, and we're focused on what we want Sycamore schools to look like 3, 5, and 10 years from now, and make sure that we start moving in that direction now, as opposed to, again, waiting and being caught behind the 8 ball. So this is just kind of an example of what a future-focused conversation can look like. Be glad to take any questions, or if there's any discussion that the board would like to have about technology, instructional technology. That was a good time to have it. And if there are other topics that you'd like to talk about in the future, please let me know, and I'll make sure that they get on there.
No, Steve, I think this is great. I mean, you told me once that sometimes a change like a pandemic can create change in a good way, and this is a prime opportunity to seize that opportunity and look toward the future to see what we've learned and apply that. So I'm really happy that you're thinking past this time and being able to use what we have learned to better our students in the future. I was part of that Pulaski trip up to Wisconsin on the Flex Mod.
Yeah.
And it's also nice. I'm happy to know you weren't here for that, but it was really enlightening. Nothing beats being in a building where they've implemented something that we want to do or would like to do. And it was a great trip, and we learned a lot. So I hope we can move forward with that implementation or something forward or something similar to that. So.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, and I know that there's been conversations about that, and still kind of visionary conversations at this point, because we're kind of still dealing with COVID, still doing some ice skating day to day. But we want to make sure that we don't forget about those things. And especially now during this adaptive pause, those will be topics of conversation with the admin team first. We're kind of back to remote learning, kind of had a handle on that, so we're not under this pressure all the time. So let's go back to some of these conversations. What do we want things to look like in the future, and how do we get there?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with technology is that it's constantly evolving. I mean, we're having this discussion about technology in the classroom, but we've always had some sort of technology in the classroom, whether that was calculators or electricity or whatever it may be. So now we're, I think, more specifically talking about, general computers. Is it just a tool? Is it just replacing the textbook? I think no. It's much bigger than that, or can be much bigger than that, and the trap that we can fall into is just thinking of it in that simple term that, I don't need a textbook anymore. I've got a computer with the curriculum. And I think I've been very impressed in seeing how our learning facilitators have implemented technology this year, and even going through the parent-teacher conferences and seeing a live collaborative document in front of me that 5 different teachers at the middle school are typing into at the same time while we're reviewing our own notes. I mean, that is a leap forward in being able to use technology effectively. And so I'm very interested to see how we, as a school district, can move forward with technology and enhance learning, not just deliver it in a different way. But I think that also is going to require some of that outside-the-box thinking of what does the classroom, a computerized classroom of the future, look like? Are we no longer confined to desks for 6 hours a day? How do we deal with, you're right, with the infrastructure, not just, keeping devices powered, but also connected? How do we store all that information that those children are creating over their lifetime at the school in a way that they can take it with them? What are we teaching them, not just about their standard curriculum, but how they're going to use technology once they enter the real world? Because they're going to have to think creatively about how to use the software that they're given once they're in a workplace that they may or may not be given training on. I went to a job interview several years ago and had an 8-hour-long interview at Fermilab, and they just kind of gave me some stuff and said, hypothetically, you're presented with this, what would you do with it? And if you don't have the experience of having used a wide variety of software and tools and things like that, it can be hard to go into a real-world situation like that and talk in great detail about how you would go about solving a problem. And I think that's what technology and providing our students with access to a wide variety is going to enable them to do as far as being competitive on a global landscape. So I'm very interested to see where we can go with it, but I do want us to be, thoughtful, and I do definitely want to hear feedback from the teachers as far as how they're using it and what they're seeing, what else they need to be able to take it to the next level.
Yeah. I think those are good points. And one just kind of as an aside, because this question comes up, I think, over and over again when you're talking about technology, and especially talking about increased flexibility for students and maybe students working more independently than they were before. So then eventually the conversation comes to, well, does that mean we don't need teachers anymore? And the answer to that question is absolutely we need teachers. If one of the things I've learned over the years, and really I think we've seen during the hybrid and the remote learning, is that even with technology, you have to have learning facilitators who are working with students, checking in with them. And I think, Eric, you said it really well. The technology is a tool. It doesn't get students from A to B. It helps students get from A to B, but you still need those teachers working with those students to help navigate a little bit. So it's going to take the teachers' input and their work. And I think we've surprised ourselves, at least I've been pleasantly surprised in how effective both teachers and students have been with technology. So let's take advantage of that. What did we learn, and how can we continue to improve?
I think it's very interesting because technology has been on our agenda for a long time, and I think from the very first time we had our strategic planning sessions with Chuck Schwan, he kind of focused us in that direction, and we always kind of saw the potential that was out there for that. His expression was always, let your fast runners run, and technology will let them do that. Mm-hmm. I think we went about developing technology in the district perhaps a bit more slowly than maybe we should have, but definitely in a way that made sense in terms of building the infrastructure first, and then looking at technology not as just a substitute for a textbook, but as a learning tool, and how we would incorporate that into the curriculum as a learning tool. And for some people, probably that pace was a little bit slower than what they would have liked to see. But because we were doing it with intentionality, I think it made good sense, and I think we built a really good foundation. I also think, though, that we probably have learned a lot from what's been going on with COVID, in the sense that I think probably when we were doing our strategic planning, we probably envisioned that we would have a situation very much like we do now, where everybody would be able to remotely learn and use technology and just use computers. And one of the things that we've found out, and that we're going to have to wrestle with it and work with, is the notion that not everybody does succeed with technology, and that there are some students who technology doesn't work for. And that for all of our students, there's a very important social component that can never be fulfilled by technology. And we have, as a district, I think, an obligation to help meet that need, that social need, that socialization need, that maybe previously we thought wasn't all that important. I think the current situation has called to our attention that it's extremely important, and that going forward we really have to tend to that as well as technology. And somehow we're going to have to arrive at a balance between technology and socialization, and how those two can go hand in hand to enhance the learning process. If if we had known 20 years ago or 22 years ago, whenever it was that we had that first strategic planning session, that this is, if you went all technology, this is what it would look like, we probably would have planned differently, because we wouldn't want to come to a point where we didn't have that social interaction. So COVID has kind of pushed us ahead by warp factor 5, Mr. Sulu. There are some things that we're going to take away that are going to be good, that we're going to be able to use technology, but we're also going to have to, I think, remember that there has to be that balance with some kind of socialization too, and some kind of interaction, personal interaction, and not just machines. So there's good and bad together, and the important thing is that now that we're in this COVID situation, as you say, that we learn from it. There's a lot, I think, that can be mined here, especially as we look back. There'll be some good things. There'll be a lot of bad things that we'll want to forget, but there'll also be some really good things, and there'll be some new directions, I think, that we can strike out in that are going to just make things better going forward. Other comments? Anything else?
That's it.
Okay.
Again, if you have ideas or topics or things you'd like to talk about during that part of the agenda, please let me know, and I'll make sure they get worked into the future discussions.
Next item then is open discussion and future agenda items. Future focused agenda items as well as future agenda items.
Steve referenced a message I had sent to him earlier in the week, but I'll repeat it here as an open discussion and future agenda item. And I think that as we look at what's been accomplished this year and what maybe we weren't able to accomplish, is having maybe a critical discussion about what are those ways that we can help to fill the gaps that may have been created this year, and whether that's thinking creatively about how we can adapt the calendar between now and the end of the year, or using our resources to come up with some sort of summer schooling program for those kids that need the extra help to get caught up, so that hopefully we can hit next year running, and whether that's something that has to be tuition or what. I mean, I think that we've got some opportunities here to think creatively about how we can use our facilities to be able to make the most of what's left of this year. So I'd love to have a discussion at least about what options are available, call it a massive expansion of the Oscar program for the summer or something, but what can we do with our great amount of resources here to help minimize the losses from this year.
I think that would be an excellent topic for discussion going forward. Anything else for future agenda items or open discussion? Is there a motion then to go into executive session for the consideration of matters related to the appointment, employment, compensation, or dismissal of personnel and imminent litigation?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right, moved and seconded. Roll call.
Jones?
Yes.
Davy?
Yes.
Jacobson?
Yes.
Dambeck?
Yes.
Motion carried.
All right, we'll go into executive session, and then when we conclude that, we'll return into public session and take our final votes. Okay, we're back in open session. Is there a motion to approve the personnel report as presented?
So moved?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call?
Jones,
Yes.
Davy,
Yes.
Jacobson,
Yes.
Dombeck,
Yes.
motion carried.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yeah, have a great Thanksgiving.